Hi there. In this business topic video, we're going to take a look at part of an important financial concept called break-even analysis, and in particular to focus on a concept called contribution. Contribution is a really important part of understanding break-even and incredibly valuable when it comes to working out the break-even output. So it's well worth a bit of time looking at the concept and trying to understand and get comfortable with the idea of contribution. Just to illustrate the point and to introduce the concept, imagine that I open up a shop and I decide to start selling hoverboards. Now here's the basic information. You need to make a decision. I buy my hoverboards for £50 each from my supplier, and I sell my hoverboard for £100 each. So the first question for you is, how much profit do I make on each hoverboard? What do you think the answer is? For those of you who say it's £50, that's not right. The answer is, I don't make any profit at all on buying for 50 and selling for 100. I merely contribute. The sale of each hoverboard merely contributes to my fixed costs. Because I've opened a shop, I'll have fixed costs trying to sell these things. So the concept of contribution is this idea that by selling items, I can create some kind of contribution to my fixed costs. And once those fixed costs are covered, are matched, thereafter, each time I sell one of my units, it will contribute directly to profit. And that's the idea of contribution. Once I've sold enough hoverboards to cover my fixed costs in the shop, perhaps my rent and my rates and my insurance, maybe having somebody working in the shop to take the orders. Once I've sold enough, my additional sales contribute directly to profit. So contribution, therefore, a really important concept, is what the business needs to achieve in order, first of all, to cover its fixed costs and thereafter make a profit. A really important concept. Let's have a look at contribution in a little bit more detail to illustrate how it's calculated. Now, the important point is that once I've covered my fixed costs with my contribution, every additional unit should go straight through to profit. Let's just illustrate that with this simple example. In this case, I've got revenues of £100,000 in my business. My variable costs, for example, maybe the goods that I buy from my suppliers, maybe my raw materials, my variable costs for those revenues are £40,000. Now, if you take revenues and take away variable costs from revenues, you get to what's known as contribution, which is £60,000. £100,000 less £40,000 creates this contribution of £60,000, which I'm hoping will be enough to cover my fixed costs. Let's take a look. The fixed costs in this situation are £40,000. So I've covered my £40,000 worth of fixed costs with my contribution of 60. That should leave something left. It's called profit. Profit is the difference between contribution less fixed costs. So in that case, my contribution was more than enough to cover my fixed costs. I'm operating at a profit. There's my contribution, £60,000. Now, how do we measure contribution? There are two important measures that you need to be familiar with and need to practice. And in particular, the one on the right, contribution per unit, is incredibly useful if you're asked to calculate what the break-even level is, or the break-even output. Total contribution is calculated by taking total revenues for the business and taking away the total variable costs of the business. So in any business, you can usually split costs into those which are variable and those which are fixed. For contribution, we are only interested in variable costs. It's total revenues less total variable costs. Contribution per unit is similar, but what it does is it takes account of how many units we're selling. So we take the selling price per unit and we take away the variable cost per unit to give us contribution per unit. That's a really important formula to remember, as is the next one that's coming up in a slide or two. Contribution per unit is an incredibly useful concept. Now, let's just work through a simple example of how this feeds through in terms of working the maths on contribution. So here we go. There's an example on the screen there. Product X has a selling price per unit of £10 and a variable cost per unit of £4. We're told that the fixed cost of the business each month are £10,000, £10,000 per month. And we're also told that the business sells 3,000 units of product X. Okay, so it's a one product business. We have some selling and variable cost per unit information. We've got some fixed cost information, and we're told how many units are sold. So we've got all the information we need to calculate total contribution and contribution per unit. But we'll also see that we can use the same information to calculate the break-even output. So let's have a look. Well, first of all, let's work out the first two. So the contribution per unit, we remember as being the selling price less the variable cost per unit. Selling price was 10. The variable cost per unit is 4. Therefore, contribution per unit, 10 less 4 is £6 per unit. Every time I sell one of these units of product X, it contributes £6 towards my fixed costs. And if we calculate the total contribution in that month based on the 3,000 units of product X that we've sold, we can quickly see what the total contribution was. We simply multiply 3,000 units by the selling price to find out that our revenues were £30,000 in the month. We multiply the 3,000 units by the variable cost per unit of £4 to work out that our variable costs, total variable costs, were £12,000. And we know that total contribution is total revenues, £30,000, less total variable costs, £12,000. That gives me a contribution towards my fixed costs in the month of £18,000. And of course, you can see that £18,000 is the contribution per unit of 6 times by the number of units, 3,000. So 18,000 of contribution. Now the question is, do we make a profit at 18,000? Well, of course, the answer is yes, we do, because we want contribution to first of all cover our fixed costs, and everything thereafter is a profit. Our fixed costs, I think we were told, were £10,000. Therefore, our profit should be the difference between the two. 18 less 10, £8,000 should be the profit that we earn in the month by selling 3,000 units at a contribution of £6 each. Now, this contribution per unit is an incredibly useful number to work out, and often you'll be able to get very high marks and use it very effectively to calculate anything to do with the break-even output. Don't forget, break-even output is the point at which the numbers of units you've made and sold are sufficient to enable revenues to equal total costs. In other words, you're not making a profit, but you're not making a loss. You've broken even. And the formula to use is this: break-even output expressed in units is calculated as fixed costs, the total fixed costs, divided by the contribution per unit. This will always work. So break-even output, always expressed in terms of units, is fixed costs divided by contribution per unit. Let's have a look using our example. Well, I think it's going to be 1667 units. Let's check. The fixed costs of £10,000, and we know that the contribution per unit was £10 less 4, £6 per unit. So indeed, £6 per unit, the fixed cost of 10,000 gives you a break-even output of 16,067 units. Now we know we're selling 3,000 units, so no surprise that we are selling more than we need to break even, and therefore we're making a profit in the month. So a quick reminder then, we'll do some further videos that explain a bit more about contribution per unit and how you can improve contribution per unit and therefore reduce the break-even output. So we'll cover that in other videos. But this is a key slide to remember. Total contribution is total revenues less total variable costs. And perhaps the most important one to remember, contribution per unit is selling price per unit less variable cost per unit. If you use that to divide fixed costs, it will always give you the break-even output. So that's been an introduction to this concept called contribution, and we've also looked briefly at contribution per unit and seen how we can use this to calculate the break-even output.